Objectively speaking, when we only take the measurable facts into consideration, no president had ever been worse for South Africa than Cyril Ramaphosa. South Africa's economy had been in a decline when adjusted for inflation over the past 30 years, but today we are at an exceptional low, with a lower total GDP than we even had in 2007. In order to keep up the national standard of living and continue to afford everyday products despite global inflation, an economy needs to grow ideally at the same rate close to the international average and in line with its population growth. In this sense, South Africa had completely stagnated. To illustrate this point, let's look at this graph. It is a depiction of the economic growth of Poland, which had very close to the same GDP per capita in the 90s as South Africa, but had a relatively stable economic growth since then and until today. It is easy to see that Poland's line depicting GDP per person growing upwards in line with globalized inflation, while South Africa's had largely stagnated but starting to drop in recent years. Of course, this is not all Ramaphosa's fault, but rather a multi-decade long decline, accelerating as the legacy of a functioning system crumbled exponentially. But Ramaphosa still had a significant impact on the decline, which we will discuss at length in this video. Good day, dear friends. Willem Petzer speaking. Be sure to subscribe for more analysis like this in your interest and join our WhatsApp to keep you up to date with all the work being done by the Willem Petzer Group. Just send your name and surname on WhatsApp to the number on the screen. We are also offering a membership where you can support us financially for extra benefits. To find out more, please message "Tell me more" to the number on the screen. Of all the ANC presidents that had ruled this country since 1994, Cyril Ramaphosa has had the most devastating impact on the country's economy by quite some distance. This is when one takes into account how much the economy has grown, as well as how much debt the country accumulated under each presidency. Since 1994, 5 ANC presidents have ruled the country, starting with Nelson Mandela, Thabo Mbeki, Kgalema Motlanthe, Jacob Zuma and Cyril Ramaphosa. For the sake of our study, we exclude Motlante's presidency for the simple reason that at 7 months, his term was so short-lived, no fair comparison with presidents who served 1 or 2 full terms would be possible. So let's start at the beginning of ANC rule. Under the presidency of Nelson Mandela, the average annual GDP growth rate was 2.7%. But it must be kept in mind that he inherited a fully functional first world economy and national infrastructure. Furthermore, during his presidency, South Africa also attracted unprecedented international investments. So while the growth rate under his presidency from 1994 to 1999 was healthy, this cannot in itself be attributed to the policies of the ANC under his rule. The GDP growth under Thabo Mbeki was even more impressive. During his 10 years in office, the country's GDP not only grew by more than 4% annually, with our national debt actually decreasing as a percentage of our GDP, making Mbeki by far the most successful of all ANC presidents this country had ever had. Jacob Zuma also ruled for almost a decade, and it is well known that his time in office from 2009 to 2018 was marked by several prominent corruption scandals, with court cases still continuing to this day. During his time in office, GDP growth absolutely plummeted to an average of 1.7% per year. But what is perhaps more significant is that while neither Mandela nor Mbeki's governments accumulated significant national debt, the debt under Zuma rose from a mere 28% of the South African GDP to an astonishing 56%. Our national debt doubled during his time in office. So this was the state of our economy when Cyril Ramaphosa took office in 2018. When analyzing Ramaphosa's performance as president, it must also be kept in mind that some of the impact of the COVID-19 era cannot be laid squarely at the feet of his government. So for the sake of a fair analysis, we have decided to remove 2020, the year in which lockdowns devastated not only our economy, but most economies worldwide, from the equation entirely. Yet, even without 2020, the annual economic growth under Ramaphosa has been significantly lower than it had been even under Jacob Zuma. Excluding 2020, the economy has grown by a mere 1.5% per year under Ramaphosa, which still represents a growth rate that is 12% lower than during Zuma's tenure in office. Moreover, when we include the rise of national debt, the picture looks even much darker. Under Ramaphosa, our national debt has increased from 56% of the GDP to 75% of the GDP today. This 19% increase over the past 6 years even outpaces the annual increase in debt under Jacob Zuma. In fact, the increase of our national debt under Ramaphosa's presidency has become such a massive crisis that it had been described recently as a ticking time bomb. Davie Rood highlights that the government debt now amounts to almost 100,000 rands, or around $5,000 for every single South African citizen. And that the interest this government accumulates on our national debt now amounts to almost 13,000 rands, or $650 every single second. Now, just to give you a clear and concise picture of the extent to which the South African economy has been destroyed under Ramaphosa's leadership, consider this. Hold on to your seats, because this figure I'm about to provide will shock you. When Jacob Zuma left office in February 2018, the GDP of this country amounted to almost $7,000 per person, while the national debt amounted to just under $4,000 per person. Today, after 7 years under Cyril Ramaphosa, the average South African is far less productive, and we owe a lot more money. Now, the GDP per person is just under $6,500, while the national debt amounts to just around $5,000 per person. This is a clear indication that South Africans have become not just marginally, but significantly poorer during Ramaphosa's time in office, and of course during the time of the so-called Government of National Unity. Then, of course, there is the burning issue of unemployment. When the ANC took over this country in 1994, unemployment was still well under 20%. This figure grew to 23% under Mandela, stabilized under Mbeki, but grew again to around 27% by the time Jacob Zuma left office in 2018. Under Ramaphosa, however, our national unemployment figure has risen to 32%. Official data indicates that 1 in every 3 people in this country is unemployed at the moment, with youth unemployment rate, that is of people aged 16 to 24, jumping from 52 to over 60% under Ramaphosa's tenure as president. This is of course only the narrow view of unemployment, meaning only those actively seeking for jobs are counted as unemployed. When we take the broader view of unemployment, meaning that every person who is able to do work and under 60 years old is counted, the unemployment of South Africa is over 50%. More than half of South Africa's population has no source of income. The Ramaphosa government has wreaked havoc on South Africa's economy. This is especially ironic given the fact that after the Zuma years, many economists and journalists from the mainstream media especially expressed much optimism about the new president and the anticipated positive impact he would have on this country's economy. This optimism even had a name, Ramaphoria. But none of these positive expectations came true, not a single one. And the data unequivocally shows that Ramaphosa is by far the worst president this country had ever had. A second irony of Ramaphosa's failed presidency is the fact that he continually blames all of his failures on apartheid. Now, if he had blamed COVID or even his predecessor Jacob Zuma, the excuses may have come across as somewhat more plausible. As the aforementioned data points out, Such an excuse would still have been without much merit, but at least it would have come across as somewhat more credible. But to lay the blame for your own failures at the feet of a system that came to end well over 30 years ago is beyond absurd in and of itself. Yet what makes Ramaphosa's blame shifting even more ludicrous is the fact that it is completely at odds with the facts. The fact of the matter is that the ANC actually inherited a fully functioning economy in 1994 with very low unemployment compared to the rest of Africa and very well managed national debt levels. Between 1961 and 1990, the average annual GDP growth of this country was 3.3, meaning that growth actually started to slow down quite significantly once apartheid has ended. This is despite the fact that the apartheid government had been under huge international pressure and sanctions for almost a decade during their regime. In fact, by far the most economically successful leader this country had ever had since its independence was Dr. Hendrik Verwoerd. And during his tenure as Prime Minister of the Republic of South Africa from 1961 to 1966, the economy grew at an unprecedented 6% per year. The fact of the matter is that the blame for the devastation of South Africa's economy under Ramaphosa lies squarely with Ramaphosa and his ANC government. The ANC in general has caused havoc and destruction in this country for over 3 decades. But the rate of infrastructural, economic and fiscal decline under Cyril Ramaphosa in particular has truly escalated to unprecedented levels. Ramaphosa's government, and the government of national unity, has furthermore been responsible for some of the most economically and socially oppressive pieces of legislation this country has had in its history, including the infamous Bella Act as well as the Land Expropriation Act. As president, Cyril Ramaphosa has emphatically failed to positively contribute to the lives of the people of this country in any meaningful way. In fact, under his leadership, South Africa's status as a failed state has been solidified. Under Ramaphosa, South Africa has become a far poorer and even less developed country. Thanks for watching this video. Be sure to support us via paid subscription. It would help us immensely. To find out more, just WhatsApp Tell Me More to the number on the screen. Goodbye and God bless you.